Winter came to Grayson Manor the way bad news always comes. Quiet, slow, and impossible to stop once it begins. The wind pushed through cracks in the old stone walls. The halls felt colder every year. The stables stood half empty. The fires in the great hall burned smaller than they used to, because there was less wood, less coin, less of everything. 25-year-old Lavinia Grayson knew exactly how bad things had become. She knew which servants quietly gave up their own meals so the younger ones could eat. She knew which parts of the roof leaked when it rained. She knew how many days remained before the next creditor came knocking on the manor doors. She knew because she was the one who carried it all, but nobody saw her carry it. Not when her younger sister walked into a room. Annalise Grayson was beautiful. Annalise was adored. Annalise was the kind of woman people wrote songs about, even if she had never done anything to deserve a song. Lavinia was simply useful. Then one evening, everything changed. A royal messenger arrived at the gates, wearing the black and silver colors of Alpha King Benedict Blackwood. Inside the letter he carried was an offer that could save the entire pack. The Alpha King would pay off every debt the Grayson family owed. In return, he would take one daughter of Grayson blood to become his future Luna. The moment those words were read aloud, everyone in the room reached the same conclusion at the same time. It had to be Annalise. No one even glanced toward Lavinia. Not one person. But 3 nights later, a servant nobody recognized slipped quietly through the back gate of Grayson Manor. And before the sun rose again, that servant overheard a conversation that would change the fate of an entire kingdom. The morning the letter arrived started like every other morning at Grayson Manor, with Lavinia awake before the rest of the house, walking the cold halls with a lantern in her hand. She checked the kitchen first. The fire had gone out again during the night. She crouched by the hearth, fed it with the last of the dry kindling, and waited until the flames caught before she stood up and brushed the soot from her hands. Outside, frost covered the courtyard. The stable boy, a thin 12-year-old named Toby, was already awake, blowing into his hands to warm them. "Morning, Miss Lavinia," he said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Morning, Toby. Did the horses make it through the night all right? Bramble's been coughing again." Lavinia frowned. "I'll bring the warm cloth after breakfast. Keep him near the others. The warmth helps." Toby nodded and went back to his work. Lavinia continued through the courtyard, her boots crunching against the frozen ground, her mind already moving to the next problem and the one after that. This was her life. Not parties, not admiration. Just one quiet task after another, holding together a household that everyone else pretended was still standing on its own. By the time the sun was fully up, Lavinia had already checked on 3 sick servants, repaired a broken hinge on the pantry door herself, and counted what little coin remained in the household chest. The number had not improved since the week before. If anything, it was worse. She walked into the dining hall, just as her mother, Lady Clarissa, was seating herself at the table. "There you are," Clarissa said, not looking up from her tea. "Did you check on your sister's gown for the spring gathering? It needs to be ready. I'll see to it after breakfast, Mother." "Good." Clarissa finally looked at her, and her expression was the same one she always wore when speaking to Lavinia, polite, distant, and slightly disappointed, as if Lavinia were a servant who happened to share her blood. "And do try to look a bit more presentable today. We may have visitors." Lavinia almost laughed. Visitors, as if anyone of importance still wanted to be associated with the Grayson name. She sat down at the far end of the table, away from where her father, Lord Atticus Grayson, sat with his head bowed over a stack of papers. His face had grown thinner over the past year. Deep lines had formed around his eyes, the kind that came not from age, but from worry that never stopped. "Father," Lavinia said gently, "you didn't sleep again." He looked up, startled, as if he had forgotten she was in the room. "Lavinia." "No, there's too much to go through." The creditors are growing impatient. How bad is it? He hesitated, glancing toward Clarissa, who was pretending not to listen while listening very closely. Bad enough, Atticus said quietly. If something doesn't change soon, we may lose the eastern fields, possibly the manor itself. The words landed in Lavinia's chest like a stone dropping into still water. She had known things were difficult. She had not known they were this close to the edge. Before she could respond, the door to the dining hall burst open, and Annalise swept in wearing a deep green robe, her golden hair perfectly arranged despite the early hour. "Has anyone seen my blue shawl?" Annalise asked, looking around the room as if the shawl might simply appear because she wished it to. "I cannot find it anywhere, and I need it for the garden walk later." "I haven't seen it," Lavinia said. Annalise barely glanced at her. "Could you look for it? You always know where things are." It wasn't a request. It never was. "Of course," Lavinia said, standing. "Thank you," Annalise said sweetly, already moving toward the table to pour herself tea. "Honestly, I don't know what this family would do without me to keep things interesting. Everything's been so dreadfully dull lately." Lavinia paused at the door and looked back at her sister Golden, glowing, completely unaware that their family was one missed payment away from ruin. She said nothing. She simply went to find the shawl. It was nearly midday when the messenger arrived. Lavinia heard the commotion before she saw it, hurried footsteps, raised voices, the sound of the front doors being pulled open in a rush. She came down the stairs just as a man, in formal black and silver robes, stepped into the entrance hall, flanked by 2 guards. The household staff froze. Even Annalise, who had been examining her reflection in a hallway mirror, turned with wide eyes. The messenger held a sealed letter, the wax stamped with a wolf's head crest that Lavinia recognized immediately. Everyone in the kingdom recognized that crest. The Blackwood crest, the Alpha King's seal. "A message," the messenger announced. "For Lord Atticus Grayson, from His Majesty, Alpha King Benedict Blackwood." Atticus appeared from his study, his face pale. "From the Alpha King? Are you certain there isn't some mistake?" "No mistake, my lord," the messenger said, handing over the letter with both hands, as was proper. The entrance hall fell completely silent as Atticus broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Lavinia watched her father's eyes move across the page, watched his expression shift from confusion to disbelief, to something that looked almost like fear. "Father?" Lavinia asked carefully. "What does it say?" Atticus lowered the letter slowly. When he spoke, his voice was unsteady. "The Alpha King. He is offering to settle every debt this family owes. All of it. Completely." A gasp went through the staff gathered nearby. "In exchange," Atticus continued, "he asks for one of my daughters to become his future Luna." For a moment, no one moved. Then, Clarissa's hand flew to her chest, and a sound escaped her that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "A Luna? Our family? Connected to the throne itself?" Annalise's reaction was immediate. Her eyes lit up like candles, and a slow, satisfied smile spread across her face. "Well," she said, smoothing the front of her robe, "I suppose I should start preparing properly." No one corrected her. No one even looked toward Lavinia. Lavinia stood quietly near the staircase, watching her family celebrate a future that, without anyone saying it directly, had already been decided for her sister. She felt something twist in her chest. Not jealousy, exactly. She had stopped expecting things for herself a long time ago. It was something closer to a quiet ache, the kind that came from being invisible in your own home, in your own family's biggest moment. "The Alpha King wishes to visit personally," Atticus said, still reading. "In 3 days' time. He says he wants to meet the family before any formal announcement is made." 3 days? Clarissa was already moving, already calling for servants. "We have so much to prepare. Annalise's gowns, the guest chambers, the dining hall, everything must be perfect. The hall erupted into motion. Servants rushed in different directions. Clarissa began listing tasks faster than anyone could write them down. Annalise drifted toward the nearest mirror, already imagining herself as Luna Queen. And Lavinia, as she always did, quietly stepped forward to begin organizing the chaos no one else knew how to handle. That evening, after the household had finally settled and most of the family had gone to bed, Lavinia found herself in the small garden behind the manor, sitting on the stone bench beneath the old oak tree. It was the one place that felt like hers. No one ever came here. The garden had been beautiful once, back when the family could afford a full staff to tend it. Now it was overgrown in places, the flower beds wild and untrimmed, but Lavinia liked it that way. It felt honest. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and looked up at the stars. A Luna Queen. The thought still felt strange, even though it had nothing to do with her. She thought about what it would mean for the family if Annalise became Luna, the debts gone, the manor saved, their name restored. She thought about whether Annalise understood what being a Luna actually meant. Not parties and gowns and admiration, but responsibility. People depending on you. A pack looking to you for guidance, for fairness, for care. Annalise had never cared for anyone but herself. Lavinia pushed the thought away. It wasn't her place to judge. It wasn't her place to do much of anything when it came to this. "You're up late," came her father's voice. Lavinia looked up to see Atticus walking slowly toward her, his shoulders hunched against the cold. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "Too much to think about." He sat down beside her on the bench, letting out a tired breath. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Lavinia," he said eventually, "I know things have been hard. Harder on you than anyone else, I think. You've carried so much of this family on your shoulders, and I haven't. I haven't said thank you. Not nearly enough." Lavinia felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. "You don't have to say it, Father. I do." He turned to look at her, and in the dim light, she could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. "Whatever happens with this royal offer, whatever it means for this family, I want you to know that I see what you do, even if no one else does." Lavinia didn't trust her voice to answer right away. She simply nodded and looked back up at the stars. "Get some rest," Atticus said, standing slowly. 3 days isn't much time." "I will," Lavinia said. "Good night, Father." She stayed in the garden a while longer after he left, letting the cold air settle around her, letting herself feel just for a moment, both unseen and, somehow, a little less alone because of it. 3 days, she thought. 3 days until everything changes. She had no idea how right she was. 2 days' ride from Grayson Manor, inside the towering halls of Blackwood Palace, Alpha King Benedict Blackwood stood at the window of his private study, watching storm clouds gather over the mountains in the distance. He was 30 years old, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his collar and sharp grey eyes that missed very little. To his people, he was a fair ruler, strong, just, respected. But to himself, in the quiet hours when no one was watching, he was something else entirely. He was tired of advisors who only told him what they thought he wanted to hear. Tired of noble families who paraded their daughters in front of him like prized livestock at a market. Tired of smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. Behind him, his most trusted advisor, an older wolf named Lord Pemberton, cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the matter of the Grayson proposal. The decision must be finalized before you depart." Benedict didn't turn around. "I'm aware. From what our scouts report, the elder Grayson daughter Annalise is considered the great beauty of the region, charming, well-spoken, popular among the noble houses. She would be an easy choice, Your Majesty. The kind of choice that pleases everyone." "Easy," Benedict repeated, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. Everything in this palace is easy, Pemberton. Easy choices, easy smiles, easy lies. Pemberton hesitated. Your Majesty? Benedict finally turned from the window. Tell me, in all your years advising my father, and now me, how many noble daughters have stood in this palace and told me exactly what I wanted to hear? Most of them, Your Majesty. And how many of them meant a single word of it? Pemberton said nothing. He didn't need to. Benedict walked slowly across the study, his boots silent against the stone floor. I am not looking for the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, Pemberton. I have met beautiful women. I have danced with them, spoken with them, listened to them recite poetry written specifically to flatter me. None of it meant anything. Then what are you looking for, Your Majesty? Benedict stopped near the fireplace, staring into the flames for a long moment before answering. Someone real, he said quietly. Someone who would speak the same way whether I were a king or a servant. My kingdom is full of people pretending to be loyal. I need a Luna who actually is. Pemberton nodded slowly, though Benedict could tell he didn't fully understand. Few people did. The Grayson family expects your formal arrival in 3 days, as planned, Pemberton said. Shall I prepare the royal procession? Benedict was quiet for a long moment. No, he said finally. Your Majesty, I'll arrive a day early, alone, as a servant. Pemberton's eyebrows rose so sharply they nearly disappeared into his hairline. A servant? Your Majesty, with respect, that is highly unconventional. The risk to your safety alone, I can take care of myself, Pemberton. I've been doing it since before you started worrying about my safety. But why? Why go to such lengths? Benedict looked back toward the window, toward the dark clouds rolling slowly across the sky. Because I want to see them when they think no one important is watching, he said. I want to see how they treat servants, how they speak when they believe there's nothing to gain from pretending. If I arrive as the Alpha King, every word I hear will be performed for my benefit. I won't learn anything true. And if you're discovered, then I'll simply be an Alpha King who arrived a day early to look around his future home. Hardly a crime. A faint, humorless smile crossed his face. But I don't intend to be discovered. Pemberton studied him for a long moment, then bowed his head. As you wish, Your Majesty. I'll have appropriate clothing prepared. Plain. Nothing that would draw attention. Good. Benedict turned back to the fire. And Pemberton, not a word of this to anyone. Not the council, not the guards. No one. Understood, Your Majesty. After Pemberton left, Benedict remained by the fire for a long time, thinking about the letter he had sent, the offer he had made, and the family he was about to meet. A daughter of Grayson blood, the letter had said. Not a name, not a specific person. He had left it deliberately open, a small test in itself, though he doubted anyone reading the letter would notice. He wondered, briefly, what kind of woman he would find waiting for him at the end of this journey. He had a feeling, though he couldn't explain why, that it might not be the one everyone expected. 2 days later, as the sun began to set behind the hills surrounding Grayson territory, a lone traveler in plain gray clothing walked along the dirt road leading toward Grayson Manor. He carried a simple leather bag over one shoulder and walked with the steady, unhurried pace of a man who had nowhere urgent to be, though his sharp gray eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of the land around him. The condition of the fences, the state of the fields, the way the villagers along the road glanced at him, curious, but not afraid. A good sign. Fear meant a harsh ruler. Curiosity meant something gentler. By the time Benedict reached the outer wall of Grayson Manor, the sky had turned a deep orange, fading toward purple at the edges. He paused at the gate, studying the estate before him. It was smaller than he expected, older, too, the stone weathered, parts of the outer wall crumbling in places that hadn't been repaired. A once grand fountain in the courtyard sat dry and cracked. The manor had clearly been beautiful once. Now it wore its decline openly, like a person too tired to hide their exhaustion anymore. He approached the side gate, where a young stable boy was leading 2 horses back toward the stables for the night. "Evening," Benedict said casually. "I've come about possible work. Heard this house might need extra hands before some important visitors arrive." The boy Toby looked him over, clearly unsure. "You'd have to ask the housekeeper. Or Miss Lavinia, maybe. She handles most things around here." "Miss Lavinia?" "The elder daughter," Toby said, as if this were obvious. "She's the one who actually keeps the place running, if you ask me, though nobody really asks me anything." He shrugged and continued leading the horses away. "Kitchen entrance is round back, if you want to try there." Benedict watched him go, turning the boy's words over in his mind. The elder daughter, not the one mentioned by name in any of the reports his scouts had gathered. The reports had been entirely focused on Annalise, her beauty, her popularity, her suitability as a future Luna. No one had mentioned an elder sister at all. Interesting, Benedict thought, and made his way toward the kitchen entrance. The kitchen was warm and smelled of bread and herbs, a sharp contrast to the cold evening air outside. An older woman, clearly the cook, was instructing 2 younger servants on preparations for the next few days, her voice tired but kind. "And make sure the good linens are aired out properly this time, not just shaken and folded again like last time. We can't have the Alpha King's people thinking we don't know how to host guests." Benedict knocked lightly on the doorframe. "Pardon me. I was told someone here might need extra help before your important guests arrive." The cook turned, looking him over with the practiced eye of someone who had hired and fired many hands over the years. "And who might you be?" "Just passing through. Heard there might be work." Before the cook could respond, a voice came from further inside the kitchen. "We can always use extra hands, especially with so much to prepare." A young woman stepped into view, wiping her hands on a cloth tied around her waist. Her dark hair was pulled back simply, a few loose strands framing her face, and there was a smudge of flour on her cheek that she clearly hadn't noticed. She looked at Benedict, and for a moment, something in her gaze made him pause. Not suspicion, not the careful evaluation he was used to from nobles assessing a stranger's usefulness, but simple, open kindness. "You've traveled a long way, by the look of your boots," she said. "There's a place by the fire if you'd like to warm up before we discuss anything. No sense talking business with frozen hands." Benedict blinked. He hadn't expected that. Not from anyone, let alone someone he assumed must be a servant herself, given how easily she moved through the kitchen. "That's very kind," he said. "Thank you." "It's nothing," she said, already turning back to whatever task she'd been doing before. "Cook, can we set him up with the others helping in the East Wing? We're short-handed there, and the rooms need to be ready before tomorrow evening." "Of course, Miss Lavinia." Benedict's gaze sharpened slightly. Miss Lavinia. This was her, the elder daughter the stable boy had mentioned, the one who, according to everything his scouts had gathered, wasn't even meant to be part of this arrangement. And yet here she was, moving through the kitchen like she belonged there more than anyone, speaking gently to servants, noticing a stranger's cold hands before asking what he wanted. Benedict said nothing more, simply nodding his thanks and moving toward the fire as instructed. But his mind was already working, already filing away small details the way he did with everything important. He had arrived expecting to observe one family. He had a feeling he was about to learn something about 2 very different daughters. Over the following hours, as the household prepared for the next day's arrivals, Benedict, known to the staff only as the new hand from the road, moved quietly through the manor, carrying linens, helping arrange furniture, and generally making himself useful in the way servants did. And he watched. He watched Annalise sweep through the halls twice, each time complaining about something. The wrong flowers had been chosen for the entrance hall. A particular gown needed re-altering immediately. The noise from the kitchen was giving her a headache. Each complaint was delivered with a smile, the kind that looked pleasant from a distance but, up close, carried an edge of expectation. Things were to be done because she said so, and quickly. He watched Lavinia move through the same halls a dozen times more, never complaining, simply solving one problem after another. A torn curtain, fixed. A nervous young servant, reassured with a few quiet words. A delivery of supplies that had arrived short, recalculated, and redistributed without fuss. At one point, he saw her kneel beside an elderly servant who had stumbled while carrying a heavy basket, helping gather the spilled contents herself, waving away the woman's embarrassed apologies. "Don't worry about it," he heard Lavinia say. "These things happen. Are you all right? You're not hurt?" "No, miss. Just clumsy old feet." "Then sit for a moment and catch your breath. I'll finish this." And she did, kneeling on the cold stone floor in her plain grey dress, gathering scattered linens without a second thought, while the elderly servant watched her with quiet gratitude. Benedict, standing nearby with an armful of firewood, found himself watching longer than he should have. Later that evening, as the household finally began to quiet down, Benedict found himself near the kitchen again, listening to two servants speak in low voices as they finished cleaning up for the night. "Did you hear?" one of them whispered. "Miss Annalise told Lady Clarissa. She's already decided what she'll wear when the Alpha King officially proposes, as if it's already settled." "Course it's settled," the other replied. "Everyone knows it'll be her. Beautiful as she is, the Alpha King won't even look twice at..." The servant stopped abruptly, glancing toward the doorway. Benedict followed her gaze and saw Lavinia passing by, carrying a stack of folded blankets, apparently not having heard or choosing not to acknowledge the unfinished sentence. But Benedict had heard it. He won't even look twice at Miss Lavinia. The servant hadn't meant any harm by it. It was simply stated as fact, the way people stated that the sky was blue, or that winter was cold. A simple, accepted truth in this household. Benedict found himself bothered by it in a way he couldn't fully explain. Later, long after most of the household had gone to sleep, Benedict made his way toward the small garden behind the manor, partly to get some air, partly because something about the place drew his attention. He had noticed earlier that this seemed to be where Lavinia spent what little free time she had. And he was right. Through the darkness, he could see two figures sitting near the old oak tree. Annalise's voice carried clearly in the quiet night airlight, amused, careless in the way of someone who never imagined anyone but the intended listener could hear. "Honestly, Lavinia, you worry far too much about all this," Annalise was saying. "Everything is going to work out perfectly. For me, at least." Benedict stopped in the shadows near the garden wall, half hidden by an overgrown hedge. He hadn't planned to listen, but something told him he should. The garden was quiet, except for the soft rustle of wind through the bare branches of the old oak tree. Annalise sat on the stone bench, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, while Lavinia stood nearby, arms crossed against the cold, clearly only there because her sister had asked her to come. "I still don't understand why you wanted to talk out here," Lavinia said. "It's freezing. Because I can't think properly inside, with Mother fussing over every little detail." Annalise stretched her arms above her head and let out a long, satisfied sigh. "Can you believe it, Lavinia? Me, future Luna of the entire kingdom. I'll have servants of my own, proper ones, not like the tired old staff we have here. I'll have gowns made by the finest tailors in Blackwood. I'll never have to worry about money again. It's a big responsibility, Annalise. Being a Luna isn't just about gowns and servants." Annalise waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, don't be so dramatic. I'll figure all that out later. The important thing is that I'll finally have the life I deserve." Benedict, hidden in the shadows near the garden wall, felt something cold settle in his chest. He had heard versions of this conversation before, different words, same meaning, from a dozen different noble daughters over the years. The crown as a prize, the title as an accessory, nothing about the people, nothing about the kingdom. He almost turned to leave. He had heard enough, hadn't he? He already knew how this would end. But then Annalise spoke again, and something in her tone made him pause. Honestly, the Alpha King part is the only slightly tedious bit, Annalise said, examining her nails in the moonlight. From what I've heard, he's terribly serious, always working, never smiling. Sounds exhausting, doesn't it? Maybe he has reasons to be serious, Lavinia said quietly. Running a kingdom isn't easy. Perhaps. But that's not really my concern, is it? I'll be Luna. I'll have the title, the wealth, the respect. As for the man himself, Annalise let out a small laugh. Well, I'm sure I can find ways to keep myself entertained. Vincent Hawthorne will be at the spring gathering, you know. He's always been rather fond of me. Lavinia's voice grew sharper. Annalise, you'd be his mate, his Luna. That's not something you... Oh, don't lecture me, Lavinia. You worry about loyalty and honesty and all those things because you've never had to think about anything else. But I'm telling you, once I have the crown, no one is going to question what I do with my time. That's the entire point of power. You get to do as you please. Benedict stood frozen behind the hedge, every word landing like a small blow. He had suspected. He had feared. But hearing it spoken so plainly, so casually, by the woman his advisors had practically begged him to choose, it confirmed everything he had been afraid was true about the world he lived in. That's not what a mate bond is supposed to be, Lavinia said, and there was something different in her voice now. Not anger exactly, but a kind of quiet, firm conviction. It's not a transaction, Annalise. It's not something you use and then ignore. The Alpha King, whoever he ends up choosing, deserves someone who actually wants to stand beside him, not someone who just wants what comes with him. Annalise rolled her eyes, though Lavinia couldn't see it in the dim light, spoken like someone who's never had anyone want her for anything. The words hung in the cold night air. Benedict felt his jaw tighten. If Lavinia was hurt by the comment, she didn't let it show in her voice. Maybe that's true, she said simply. But at least I know what's right, even if no one ever offers it to me. Right. Wrong, does it even matter? In the end, people like us don't get to choose. Father will hand one of us over to the Alpha King because our family needs the money, and that's simply how it is. I'd rather be the one with the crown than the one left behind. Wouldn't you? I'd rather be honest, Lavinia said. Even if it means being left behind. Annalise sighed dramatically and stood, brushing off her cloak. You're impossible sometimes, you know that? Anyway, I should go inside. I need my rest. Tomorrow's a big day, after all. She paused, glancing back at her sister. You should come in too. Standing out here in the cold won't change anything. I'll be in soon, Lavinia said. I just need a few minutes. Annalise shrugged and walked back toward the manor, her footsteps light and unhurried, completely unaware of the figure hidden in the shadows nearby, completely unaware of what she had just revealed. Benedict remained still, watching as Lavinia stayed behind, alone in the garden, wrapping her arms tighter around herself against the cold. He should leave now too. He had heard what he needed to hear, but he found himself staying, watching her in the moonlight, curious despite himself. Lavinia walked slowly toward the old oak tree and placed her hand against its trunk, the way someone might greet an old friend. I know it doesn't make sense to talk to a tree, she said softly, and for a moment, Benedict thought she might be speaking to herself, until he realized she might actually believe she was alone. But you're the only one who actually listens, so... She let out a small, tired laugh, the kind that held no real humor in it. Do you ever wonder, she continued quietly, what it would be like to matter to someone? Not because of what you can give them, not because of what they need from you, just Because of who you are. Benedict's chest tightened. I used to think it would happen eventually. Lavinia went on. That if I just kept doing the right thing, kept being useful, kept being kind, someone would notice eventually. But I don't think that's how it works, is it? People notice gowns. They notice beauty and charm and the things that sparkle. She looked up at the stars. They don't notice the person holding everything together in the background. Not really. She was quiet for a long moment. It's all right, though, she said eventually, her voice steadying. Annalise will become Luna. The family will be saved. That's what matters. That's enough. She didn't sound like she fully believed her own words. But she said them anyway, the way people did when they were trying to convince themselves of something. After a moment, she turned and walked back toward the manor, leaving the garden empty and quiet behind her. Benedict remained hidden in the shadows for a long time after she had gone, staring at the spot where she had stood, replaying her words in his mind. People notice gowns. They notice beauty and charm and the things that sparkle. They don't notice the person holding everything together in the background. He thought about every noble daughter he had ever met, every practiced smile, every carefully chosen word designed to please him, to win him over, to secure a crown. And then he thought about a woman in a plain grey dress, kneeling on a cold stone floor to help an elderly servant gather spilled linens, a woman who spoke about loyalty and honesty to a sister who mocked her for it, a woman who, when she believed no one was listening, spoke not of crowns or wealth, but of simply wanting to matter to someone. Benedict had come to Grayson Manor expecting to evaluate one daughter. He realized now that he had been looking at the wrong one entirely. He stood there in the cold for a long while, the weight of what he had heard settling over him. Tomorrow, he would arrive as the Alpha King. Tomorrow, the family would present their chosen daughter, expecting him to confirm what they had already decided. But Benedict had heard the truth tonight, the real truth, the kind that only came out when no one thought a king was listening, and he already knew what he was going to do with it. He turned and walked quietly back toward the servants' quarters, his mind made up, his heart for the first time in longer than he could remember, feeling something other than tired. Tomorrow, everything would change. He just hoped Lavinia Grayson was ready for it. The next morning, Grayson Manor was a storm of activity. Servants rushed through the halls carrying flowers, polishing silverware, adjusting curtains that had already been adjusted a dozen times. The entrance hall had been transformed overnight, fresh flowers arranged in every corner, the old stone floors scrubbed until they gleamed, the family's best and only remaining tapestries hung carefully to hide the worst of the wall damage. Lavinia had been awake since before dawn, moving through the manor like a quiet current beneath all the chaos, making sure everything that needed to happen actually happened, while everyone else focused on appearances. She found Toby in the stables, brushing down the horses with extra care. "How are they looking?" she asked. "Better, Miss Lavinia. Bramble's cough is easing up, like you said it would. Good. Make sure the courtyard gate is clear. The Alpha King's procession will need space. Already done, miss." She moved on, checking the kitchen, where the cook was overseeing what was easily the largest meal preparation the manor had attempted in years. She checked the guest chambers, making sure everything was as presentable as possible given their limited resources. She checked on the strange new servant from the night before, the quiet one with the sharp eyes, but he seemed to have already started his work for the day, helping carry additional chairs into the great hall for the formal reception. By midday, the household was as ready as it could possibly be. And then, in the distance, horns sounded. The royal procession had arrived. Lavinia stood near the back of the entrance hall, exactly where she always stood out of the way, present but unnoticed, ready to handle whatever needed handling. In front of her, the rest of the family had arranged themselves with great care. Lord Atticus stood at the center, his best and only formal robes brushed and pressed. Lady Clarissa stood beside him, practically glowing with anticipation, and in front of them both, positioned as the clear centerpiece of the entire gathering, stood Annalise. She wore a deep blue gown that had taken 3 seamstresses 2 full days to alter properly. Her golden hair had been styled elaborately, woven with small white flowers. She looked, Lavinia had to admit, every bit the part of a future lunar queen. Remember, Clarissa was whispering to Annalise, modest but warm, confident, but not too forward. Let him come to you. I know, Mother, Annalise whispered back, though her excitement was barely contained beneath her composed expression. The great doors of the entrance hall opened, and Alpha King Benedict Blackwood walked in. Gone was the plain grey clothing of the night before. He wore formal black and silver robes, the Blackwood crest embroidered across his chest, a simple but unmistakably royal circlet resting against his dark hair. He carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to be announced, it simply was. Behind him walked several advisors and guards, but Benedict's gaze moved past all of them, scanning the room. Lavinia, from her place near the back, watched the Alpha King enter and felt something strange settle over her. He looked familiar, somehow. The way he moved, the sharpness in his eyes. But she pushed the thought aside. She'd never met an Alpha King before. He simply looked the way she imagined a king should look, powerful, composed, and entirely out of place in their fading manner. Your Majesty, Atticus said, bowing deeply. Welcome to Grayson Manor. We are deeply honored by your presence. Lord Grayson, Benedict said, his voice calm and even. Thank you for receiving me. Of course. Of course. Please, allow me to introduce my family. Atticus gestured toward Clarissa, who curtsied gracefully, and then toward Annalise. My wife, Lady Clarissa. And my daughter, Annalise. Annalise said smoothly, stepping forward slightly and offering a perfect curtsy, her smile warm and practiced. It is truly an honor to finally meet you, Your Majesty. We've heard so much about you. Benedict's gaze settled on her for a moment. Lavinia watched, holding her breath without realizing it, watching the moment everyone in the room had been waiting for. But Benedict's expression didn't change. He gave Annalise a polite nod, the kind one might give to anyone being formally introduced, and then his gaze moved past her, past Clarissa, past Atticus, and settled on Lavinia. The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Lavinia felt her heart stutter. Why was the Alpha King looking at her? She wasn't part of this. She wasn't dressed for this. She was standing at the back of the room in her plain grey dress, the same dress she wore every day, completely unprepared for any kind of royal attention. And this? Benedict asked, his eyes not leaving Lavinia. There was a beat of confused silence. That's... Atticus glanced between Benedict and Lavinia, clearly thrown off. That's my elder daughter. Your Majesty. Lavinia. Lavinia. Benedict repeated, and something about the way he said her name made Lavinia's chest tighten in a way she couldn't explain. He stepped forward, walking past Annalise, past the woman the entire family had spent 3 days preparing as the future Lunar Queen, and stopped directly in front of Lavinia. A ripple of confused murmurs spread through the room. Annalise's confident smile faltered, just slightly, her eyes following Benedict's movement with growing disbelief. Lavinia stood frozen, unsure of what was happening, unsure of what to say or do. Up close, Benedict's grey eyes were even sharper than they had appeared from a distance, and there was something in them that made Lavinia feel, for the first time in longer than she could remember, completely seen. Lord Grayson, Benedict said, without turning away from Lavinia. My letter stated that I would take a daughter of Grayson blood as my future Luna, not a specific name. A daughter of Grayson blood. Yes, Your Majesty, that's correct. But we assumed I understand what was assumed. Benedict's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now, something firm beneath the composure. But assumptions are not facts, Lord Grayson, and I did not travel here to confirm an assumption. He turned slightly, addressing the room without raising his voice, though somehow every word carried clearly through the silent hall. "I arrived in this region a day early," he said. "I did not announce myself. I came as a servant, and I observed this household as it truly is not as it presents itself for royal visits." Lavinia's breath caught. The new servant. The quiet one with the sharp eyes. The one who had helped carry firewood and linens through the manor the night before. It had been him. The Alpha King had been in their home, unrecognized, for an entire day. "Last night," Benedict continued, his gaze flicking briefly toward Annalise, whose face had gone pale. "I happened to overhear a conversation in the garden. Two sisters, speaking freely, believing themselves to be unobserved. The color drained completely from Annalise's face. One of those sisters spoke of crowns and wealth, and the freedom that power would grant her, freedom to disregard the very bond she would be entering into." Benedict's voice remained level, but there was something cold beneath it now. She spoke of her future mate as an inconvenience to be tolerated, while her true interests remained elsewhere. A horrified silence fell over the room. Clarissa's hand had risen to her mouth. Atticus looked between Benedict and his younger daughter with dawning, horrified understanding. "The other sister," Benedict continued, and his voice changed, softened, just slightly, as he turned back to Lavinia, spoke of loyalty, of honesty, of what a mate bond is meant to be, not a transaction, not a means to an end, but something built on truth, even when truth is difficult. Lavinia's heart was pounding so loudly she could barely hear anything else. "That same sister," Benedict said quietly, his eyes never leaving hers, believed, when she thought no one was listening, that she would never matter to anyone, that people only notice beauty and charm and things that sparkle and never notice the person holding everything together. He paused. She was wrong. The hall was utterly silent. Even the servants standing near the walls had stopped moving entirely. "Lord Grayson," Benedict said, finally turning back to address Atticus, though his words were meant for everyone in the room. "The offer in my letter remains unchanged. I will settle every debt this family owes completely, and without condition." He turned back to Lavinia. "But the daughter I choose," he said, "is Lavinia Grayson." For a long moment, no one in the hall moved. No one breathed. Then Annalise's voice cut through the silence, high and disbelieving. That's not possible. There must be some mistake. I'm the one who—" "There is no mistake," Benedict said, without looking at her. His attention remained entirely on Lavinia, whose face had gone through several emotions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and now something that looked dangerously close to tears. "Your Majesty," Lavinia said quietly, her voice trembling slightly. I don't understand. I'm not. I wasn't prepared for any of this. I'm not what anyone expected, I know," Benedict said simply. "That's precisely why I'm asking." He extended his hand toward her, not demanding, not commanding, simply offering. "I'm not asking you to accept a crown, Lavinia," he said, his voice quiet now, meant only for her, though the silence of the hall meant everyone could hear it anyway. "I'm asking if you would be willing to stand beside me, as my equal, as someone I could trust completely, in a world full of people I cannot trust at all." Lavinia looked down at his outstretched hand, then up at his face, searching, perhaps, for some sign that this was a mistake, a trick, a misunderstanding that would resolve itself at any moment. She found none, only quiet, steady sincerity. Behind her, she could hear Annalise's breathing growing increasingly unsteady, could feel her mother's stunned silence, could sense her father's shock radiating through the room. But none of that mattered, not in this moment. What mattered was the simple, impossible truth standing in front of her. A king, the Alpha King, looking at her the way no one had ever looked at her before. Not past her, Not through her, at her. Lavinia took a slow breath, steadying herself, and placed her hand in his. "Yes," she said quietly. "I accept." A small, genuine smile crossed Benedict's face, the first real smile anyone in that hall had seen from him since he'd arrived. "Then it's settled," he said. Behind them, the hall remained in stunned silence, broken only by the sound of Annalise's quiet, furious breathing, and Lady Clarissa slowly sinking into the nearest chair, completely overwhelmed. But Lavinia barely noticed any of it. For the first time in her life, she had been chosen, not because of what she could provide, not because of how she looked, but because of who she was. And as Benedict gently squeezed her hand, Lavinia felt something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Hope. The days that followed Benedict's announcement passed in a blur Lavinia could barely keep up with. Within a week, the formal arrangements had been made. The Grayson family's debts were settled in full, exactly as promised. Lavinia watched her father's shoulders, which had been hunched under invisible weight for as long as she could remember, finally straighten, even if only slightly. The wedding itself was small by royal standards, held quietly at Blackwood Palace rather than with the grand public ceremony that typically accompanied a Luna's selection. Benedict had explained, gently, that he thought Lavinia might prefer it that way, and he had been right. "You don't have to pretend to enjoy the attention," he told her, the morning of the ceremony, as she stood nervously in unfamiliar royal chambers, wearing a gown finer than anything she had ever owned. "I know this is a great deal, all at once." "Is it that obvious?" Lavinia asked, attempting a small smile. "Only to someone paying attention," Benedict said, "which, fortunately for you, I happen to be quite good at." The ceremony itself passed quickly. Vows exchanged, the mate bond formed, a brief acknowledgement before the gathered nobles and palace staff, and then, almost before Lavinia could fully process it, she was no longer simply Lavinia Grayson. She was Lavinia Blackwood, Luna of the Blackwood Kingdom. Blackwood Palace was unlike anything Lavinia had ever known. The halls stretched longer than the entire Grayson Manor combined. Every room seemed designed to impress: high ceilings, polished stone floors, walls lined with portraits of past Alpha Kings and Lunas, stretching back generations. Servants moved efficiently and silently, trained to anticipate needs before they were spoken. And Lavinia, for the first few days, felt completely lost. Not because anyone was unkind to her, quite the opposite. The staff treated her with careful respect, but there was a distance to it, a formality that made her feel less like a person and more like a title that had suddenly been placed upon her. Benedict, for his part, remained polite and considerate, but distant in his own way. He showed her to her chambers connected to his own by a private hallway, though she noted he made no assumptions about how she might wish to use that connection. He introduced her to key staff members. He answered her questions about palace customs and expectations with patience, but there was a careful distance between them, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever this was, this marriage, this bond, it had begun under unusual circumstances, and neither of them quite knew how to move forward from there. "You don't have to be so formal with me, you know," Lavinia said one evening, about a week after her arrival, as they shared a quiet dinner in Benedict's private dining chamber, a small, comfortable room separate from the grand, formal dining hall. Benedict looked up from his plate, slightly surprised. "Formal? You speak to me the way you might speak to a visiting dignitary," Lavinia said, not unkindly. "Polite, careful, as if you're worried about saying the wrong thing." Benedict was quiet for a moment. "I suppose I am, in a way." "Why?" "Because," he said slowly, choosing his words with obvious care, "everything about how this began was unusual. You didn't choose this, Lavinia." "Not really. I made a decision, and you accepted it, but I'm aware that accepting and wanting aren't always the same thing." He paused. I don't want you to feel as though you have to pretend to be comfortable here, simply because there's no graceful way to say otherwise. Lavinia considered this for a moment, turning her fork slowly in her hands. Can I be honest with you? She asked finally. I would prefer nothing less, Benedict said, and there was something in his tone, a faint echo of what she'd overheard him saying to Annalise's mockery, though she didn't know that. This is strange, Lavinia admitted. All of it. A week ago, I was worrying about whether we'd have enough firewood for the winter, and now I'm here, in a palace, married to a king I'd never met before 3 days before our wedding. She let out a small, slightly disbelieving laugh. It's a lot. I imagine it is. But, Lavinia continued, more quietly now, it's also the first time in my life that someone chose me, not because of what I could give them, or how I looked, or what I could be useful for, just because of who I actually am. She looked up at him. That's not nothing, Benedict. Even if everything else is strange, that part means something to me. Something shifted in Benedict's expression. A softening, subtle, but real. It means something to me too, he said quietly. More than I think I expected it to. For the first time since her arrival, the silence between them felt comfortable rather than careful. Over the following weeks, that comfort grew, slowly, in small moments that Lavinia would later think back on as the true beginning of everything. She began exploring the palace, not as a guest being given a tour, but the way she had once moved through Grayson Manor, noticing things that needed attention and quietly seeing to them herself. She noticed that several of the younger palace servants seemed nervous and overworked, afraid to make mistakes in front of palace nobility. She began learning their names, asking about their families, treating them the way she had always treated the staff at Grayson Manor, as people, not simply as service. You don't have to do that, you know, one of the senior staff members told her gently after observing Lavinia help. A young servant girl who had spilled a tray of dishes, gathering the pieces alongside her rather than simply calling for someone else to clean it up. It's not expected of the Luna. I know it's not expected, Lavinia said, smiling at the wide-eyed servant girl who looked equal parts mortified and grateful. But I don't see why that means I shouldn't do it anyway. Word of moments like these spread quietly through the palace staff, not in any dramatic way, but in the quiet manner that genuine respect tends to spread. The new Luna noticed people. She remembered names. She treated the lowest servant with the same warmth she showed visiting nobility. Benedict, for his part, noticed too. He began finding reasons to be in the same parts of the palace as Lavinia during the day. Not obviously, not in any way either of them commented on directly, but reasons nonetheless. A report that could be reviewed in the library, where Lavinia often spent her afternoons. A walk through the gardens that happened to pass by wherever Lavinia was overseeing some small improvement to the grounds. Their conversations, which had started careful and formal, began to stretch longer. Dinners that once passed in polite, comfortable silence, now filled with discussion about the kingdom, about people they'd met that day, about small observations that made the other laugh. One evening, several weeks into her time at the palace, Lavinia found Benedict in the library long after most of the palace had gone quiet for the night. He sat near the fireplace, a book open on his lap, though his eyes were fixed on the flames rather than the pages. You look like you're thinking very hard about something that isn't in that book, Lavinia observed, settling into the chair across from him. Benedict glanced up, a faint, tired smile crossing his face. Astute, as always. Anything you want to talk about? He was quiet for a long moment, and Lavinia waited, learning by now that Benedict often needed time to gather his thoughts before sharing them. The kingdom is not as stable as it appears from the outside, he said finally. There are noble families, powerful ones who have grown comfortable with influence. They were never meant to have permanently. My father allowed certain Arrangements, in his final years, that I've spent most of my reign trying to undo. What kind of arrangements? Favorable trade agreements that benefit a handful of wealthy packs, while smaller territories struggle. Land disputes that were never properly resolved, simply ignored, because resolving them would upset families with influence at court. He sighed, rubbing a hand across his face. I've made some progress, but every step forward seems to create 3 new problems. And I sometimes wonder if any of it actually helps the people it's supposed to help, or if I'm simply rearranging which powerful families benefit most. Lavinia listened quietly, and when he finished, she didn't immediately offer reassurance or easy answers. Something Benedict, she had noticed, seemed to appreciate more than he let on. "Can I ask you something?" she said instead. "Of course. When you make these decisions, the trade agreements, the land disputes, who do you talk to about them? Before you decide. I mean, my council, mostly. Lord Pemberton and the others. And are they the ones affected by these decisions? The smaller territories, the families struggling?" Benedict paused. "No, not directly. So you're making decisions about people's lives based on advice from people who don't live those lives," Lavinia said gently, not as a criticism, simply as an observation. Benedict was quiet for a long moment, and Lavinia worried, briefly, that she'd overstepped. But then he let out a slow breath, and something in his expression shifted, not offense, but something closer to relief. "You're right," he said quietly. "I hadn't thought about it that way, but you're right. I'm not saying your counsel is wrong about everything," Lavinia added quickly. "I just at Grayson Manor, when something needed fixing, I always tried to talk to the people actually affected by it. The servants, the tenant families, whoever was closest to the problem. They usually knew things the people in charge never thought to ask about." Benedict looked at her for a long moment, really looked, the way he had on the day they'd first met, when he'd chosen her in front of an entire stunned household. "Would you be willing to help with that?" he asked. "Not simply giving advice from a distance, actually meeting with people. Hearing directly from the territories my council tends to overlook." Lavinia blinked, surprised by the directness of the request. "You want me involved in matters of the kingdom?" "Officially, you've been involved since the moment you arrived, Lavinia," Benedict said. "I'd simply like to acknowledge that properly, rather than pretending it isn't happening." Lavinia felt warmth spread through her chest, not just at the request itself, but at what it represented. He wasn't simply asking for her opinion as a formality. He was genuinely asking for her help, treating her as someone whose perspective mattered to the actual running of the kingdom. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that very much." Benedict smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes and softened the careful composure he wore so often. "Then it's settled," he said, echoing the words from their first meeting, though this time they carried an entirely different weight. In the months that followed, Lavinia threw herself into her new role with the same quiet determination she had once brought to managing Grayson Manor, except now, instead of stretching limited resources to keep a single household running, she was helping shape decisions that affected an entire kingdom. She began traveling not far at first, simply to nearby villages and smaller pack territories within a day's ride of the palace. She visited without grand announcements, often accompanied only by a small escort, dressed simply enough that people didn't immediately feel the need to perform for royalty. In one border village, she spent an afternoon speaking with farming families who had been struggling under a trade agreement that heavily favored a larger, wealthier pack territory nearby. "It's not that the larger pack treats us unfairly, exactly," one of the farmers explained. An older man named Cornelius, who had clearly never expected to be having this conversation with the kingdom's Luna. "It's more that the agreement was written without anyone really considering what happens to us. Their needs come first, automatically, and whatever's left over comes to us. Most years, that's enough. This year, with the harvest being poor everywhere, it isn't. Has anyone from the council come to speak with your village about this?" Lavinia asked. Cornelius gave a tired laugh. With respect, my lady, no one from the council has set foot in this village in longer than I can remember. We send reports, same as everyone else. Whether anyone reads them. He shrugged. Lavinia made careful notes, not just about the trade agreement itself, but about dozens of small details that wouldn't have appeared in any formal report. Which families were struggling most. How the poor harvest had affected different parts of the village differently. What kind of adjustments might actually help, versus what might look helpful on paper but fail to address the real problem. When she returned to the palace and presented her findings to Benedict and the council, there was some initial resistance, not hostile, but the kind of polite skepticism that came from advisors unused to having their assumptions questioned by someone they still, in some corner of their minds, thought of as an unexpected addition to the royal family. With respect, Your Majesty, one council member said carefully, addressing Benedict rather than Lavinia directly, while the Luna's initiative is admirable. Matters of trade agreements between territories are quite complex. There are histories, precedents. I'm aware of the precedents, Lord Ashford, Lavinia said evenly, before Benedict could respond. I've read through the original agreement, as well as the 3 amendments made to it over the past decade. What I haven't found in any of those documents is a single account from someone actually living in the affected village. Lord Ashford blinked, clearly not expecting her to have done that level of research. The agreement isn't wrong, Lavinia continued. It was reasonable when it was written, but circumstances have changed, and the agreement hasn't changed with them. I'm not suggesting we tear up years of precedent. I'm suggesting we adjust the distribution ratio during years of poor harvest. A small change, but one that could mean the difference between a difficult winter and a genuinely dangerous one for that village. She presented her proposed adjustment modest, carefully reasoned, backed by the specific details she'd gathered during her visit. The council was quiet for a long moment. Then Lord Pemberton, who had been listening carefully throughout, spoke up. I would need to review the specifics more closely, but this seems remarkably sound, Your Majesty. Far more grounded than most proposals that cross this table. Benedict, who had been watching the exchange with quiet pride he made no effort to hide, nodded. Then let's review it properly. Lavinia, would you be willing to walk the council through your findings in more detail? Of course. Over the following hour, Lavinia did exactly that, patiently, clearly, answering questions from council members who, by the end of the discussion, had shifted from polite skepticism to genuine engagement. The adjustment was approved within the week. It was the first of many such changes. Word began to spread slowly at first, then more quickly through smaller territories across the kingdom. The new Luna actually visited. She actually listened. And more importantly, things actually changed because of what she heard. Families who had felt forgotten by the palace for generations began to feel, for the first time, that someone in power was paying attention to them. And through it all, Lavinia and Benedict grew closer not through grand romantic gestures, but through the simple, accumulating weight of working together, trusting each other, relying on each other, in ways that went far beyond the formal arrangement that had brought them together. One evening, several months after her arrival, Lavinia found Benedict in his study late at night, surrounded by reports, looking more exhausted than she had seen him in weeks. You should be asleep, she said gently, settling into the chair across from his desk. I know. He rubbed his eyes. There's a dispute between 2 border packs that's been escalating. If it isn't resolved carefully, it could turn into something far worse than a dispute. Do you want to talk about it? Benedict hesitated, then began explaining the history of the dispute, the personalities involved, the delicate balance required to resolve it without making either side feel humiliated, which could make things worse rather than better. Lavinia listened, asked questions, offered observations, not solutions, exactly, but perspectives Benedict hadn't fully considered. By the time they finished, it was very late, and Benedict looked at her with something that had been growing in his expression for weeks now. Something warmer than respect, deeper than gratitude. "Lavinia," he said quietly, "can I tell you something? Always. Before I met you, I genuinely believed I would carry this kingdom alone. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't believe anyone existed who could actually share the weight of it. Everyone around me wanted something from the crown. No one wanted to help carry it." He paused, and Lavinia waited, sensing he wasn't finished. "You don't have to carry everything alone," she said softly, echoing words that had been forming in her mind for weeks now. "Not anymore." Benedict reached across the desk and gently took her hand, not as a formal gesture, not as part of any duty, but simply because he wanted to. "I know," he said quietly, "and I don't know how to properly thank you for that, for all of it." "You don't have to thank me," Lavinia said, her own voice softer now. "I chose this too, you know. Maybe not at first, but somewhere along the way, I stopped thinking of this as something that happened to me and started thinking of it as something I'm genuinely glad is part of my life." Benedict's thumb moved gently across her knuckles, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them filled with something that had been quietly growing for months, finally being acknowledged. "Lavinia," Benedict said softly, "I think I'm falling in love with you." Lavinia felt her breath catch, her heart suddenly racing in a way that had nothing to do with surprise, because somewhere, quietly, she had been feeling the same thing for weeks now, without fully allowing herself to name it. "I think," she said slowly, a small smile spreading across her face. "I might already be there." Benedict smiled, the kind of smile Lavinia had rarely seen from him, open and unguarded, and for the first time since they'd met, the distance between them disappeared entirely. A few weeks later, an invitation arrived at the palace, formal, gold-edged, addressed to Lord Atticus Grayson and family, for the kingdom's annual Royal Pack gathering, a grand event held at Blackwood Palace each year, attended by noble families from across the entire kingdom. It was tradition for the Luna's family to attend, and despite everything that had happened, Benedict had insisted the invitation be extended not out of obligation, but because he knew, despite everything, that Lavinia still cared about her family, even the parts of it that hadn't always deserved that care. "Are you sure about this?" Lavinia asked, looking at the invitation. "After everything that happened, I'm not inviting them for my sake, or even entirely for yours," Benedict said. "I'm simply extending the same courtesy that's always been extended to a Luna's family. What they choose to do with that courtesy is up to them." Lavinia nodded slowly, though something in her chest tightened slightly at the thought of seeing her family again, particularly Annalise for the first time since that day in the Grayson Manor entrance hall, months ago. She had a feeling the gathering would not be entirely peaceful. She had no idea how right she would be. The Royal Pack gathering was, by far, the grandest event Lavinia had witnessed since arriving at Blackwood Palace. The ballroom had been transformed golden light from hundreds of candles reflecting off polished floors, music drifting from musicians stationed along the far wall, nobles from territories across the kingdom mingling in their finest formal wear. It was, in every sense, a display of the kingdom's wealth and stability. Lavinia stood near Benedict's side, dressed in deep blue robes that complemented his black and silver, greeting arriving guests with the composed warmth she had grown into over the past months. She had come a long way from the nervous young woman who had first arrived at the palace, uncertain of her place. But when the Grayson family arrived, Lavinia felt that old uncertainty flicker briefly back to life. Lord Atticus looked healthier than she remembered. The months without the crushing weight of debt had clearly done him good. Lady Clarissa, too, seemed lighter, though her expression upon seeing Lavinia carried a complicated mixture of pride and lingering awkwardness. And Annalise looked exactly the same as she always had. Beautiful, perfectly composed, And the moment her eyes landed on Lavinia, there was something in her expression that made Lavinia's stomach tighten. "Lavinia," Atticus said warmly, embracing his daughter. "You look well. You look like a Luna, truly." "Thank you, father." Lavinia smiled, genuinely glad to see him, despite everything. "How are things at the manor?" "Better. Much better. The repairs are nearly finished, and—" he hesitated, glancing briefly at Clarissa. "We're managing well. Truly. I'm glad to hear it." Clarissa offered a more formal greeting, polite, slightly stiff, the kind of interaction that suggested old patterns took time to change, even when circumstances had. And then there was Annalise. "Lavinia," Annalise said, her voice perfectly pleasant, though her eyes carried something colder beneath the surface. "How regal you look." "Thank you, Annalise. It's good to see you." "Is it?" Annalise's smile remained fixed in place. "How fortunate things worked out so well for you. Quite the surprise, wasn't it? For everyone." There was an edge to the words that Lavinia recognized immediately, the same edge she'd grown up navigating for years. But she simply nodded, choosing not to engage with whatever Annalise was preparing. "If you'll excuse me," Lavinia said politely, "I should continue greeting our other guests." She moved on, but couldn't shake the feeling that the conversation wasn't over. She was right. Several hours into the gathering, as the formal greetings gave way to more relaxed mingling and the evening's festivities were in full swing, Lavinia found herself near a group of noble guests, engaged in pleasant conversation about recent improvements to trade routes between several territories. Conversations that, months ago, she never would have imagined being part of. It was during a brief pause in conversation that Annalise approached, several other young, noble women trailing slightly behind her, the kind of arrangement that suggested an audience had been carefully gathered. "Lavinia," Annalise said, her voice carrying just slightly louder than necessary. "I was just telling everyone about how you came to be Luna. Such a remarkable story, isn't it?" Several of the nearby nobles turned curiously, sensing something unusual in Annalise's tone. "I suppose it is," Lavinia said carefully. "It really is, though." Annalise's smile widened, taking on a sharper edge. "I mean, everyone expected the Alpha King to choose me, after all. Everyone. And then he simply walked past me and chose my sister instead. The quiet one. The one nobody ever really noticed." She let out a small, performative laugh. "Honestly, I think His Majesty must have simply felt sorry for her. A pity choice, really, in the end." The words landed in the air, sharp and deliberate, clearly meant to be overheard by as many people as possible. Lavinia felt heat rise to her face, not from embarrassment, but from a familiar, old ache. The same one she'd felt for years as the overlooked daughter, suddenly resurfacing in front of an entire ballroom of strangers. "Annalise," she started quietly. "I mean, don't take it personally, sister," Annalise continued, her voice still bright and casual, though her eyes held something far less friendly. "I'm sure His Majesty appreciates having someone useful around. Someone to handle the things he doesn't have time for. It's not so different from what you did at home, is it?" A few of the nearby nobles exchanged uncomfortable glances. Others simply watched, curious, clearly unsure whether this was a joke or something else entirely. Lavinia felt the old, familiar feeling begin to creep over her, the feeling of being unseen, of being reduced to nothing more than what she was useful for, even after everything that had changed. For a moment, just a moment, she felt like that quiet girl in the garden again, speaking to an old oak tree because no one else would listen. But then, a voice cut through the ballroom, calm, steady, and unmistakably commanding. "Annalise." The crowd parted slightly as Benedict approached, his expression composed but his eyes carrying something sharp and unyielding. "Your Majesty," Annalise said quickly, her earlier confidence faltering slightly under his gaze. I heard what you were simply doing." Benedict said evenly. And I think, perhaps, it's time the rest of this gathering heard the full story, not the version that's been quietly circulating, but what actually happened that night. The ballroom, which had already been drawn into the unfolding scene, fell into a deeper, more attentive silence. Musicians slowed, then stopped entirely. Conversations died away as more and more guests turned toward the small gathering near the center of the room. Months ago, Benedict began, his voice carrying easily across the now silent ballroom. I arrived at Grayson Manor a day earlier than expected, disguised as a servant. I wanted to see the family I'd been considering as I truly would, without the performance that typically accompanies a royal visit. Annalise's face had gone pale, the realization of what was coming clearly dawning on her. That night, Benedict continued, I happened to overhear a conversation between two sisters in the garden. One of them spoke about her future as Luna, about the wealth, the freedom, the crown she expected to receive. She spoke of her future mate bond as something to be endured, while her true interests remained directed elsewhere. She made it quite clear that, in her view, power meant the freedom to disregard the very commitment she was about to make. A murmur rippled through the gathered crowd, nobles exchanging glances, beginning to understand exactly what was being described. The other sister, Benedict continued, his voice softening slightly as his gaze moved to Lavinia, spoke of something entirely different. She spoke about loyalty, about what a mate bond should actually mean. She said that power without honesty becomes nothing more than an empty palace. She said these things not because she expected anyone to hear them, and certainly not because she expected any reward for them. She said them because she believed them. He turned back to face the crowd fully now, his voice growing firmer. I did not choose Lavinia Grayson out of pity, he said clearly, the words carrying to every corner of the ballroom. I chose her because, in a kingdom full of people who tell me what I want to hear, she was the only person I had encountered in years who spoke the truth, even when she believed no one of importance was listening. He paused, letting the words settle over the silent crowd. I chose her, he continued, because she possesses something no crown, no wealth, and no title can create. Honor. Genuine, unwavering honor. The kind that exists whether or not anyone is watching, whether or not it's ever rewarded. He turned to face Lavinia directly now, his expression softening into something far warmer than the firm authority he'd carried moments before. She is my Luna, he said, his voice quieter now, though no less certain. My partner, the reason this kingdom has begun healing in ways I never thought possible. And she is, without question, the finest person I have ever known. He reached out and gently took her hand. I love her, he said simply. Completely, and without any doubt. The ballroom remained silent for a long moment. And then, slowly, a murmur of approval began to spread through the crowd. Several nobles exchanged warm glances. A few, who had personally benefited from the changes Lavinia had championed over the past months, nodded approvingly, clearly unsurprised by anything Benedict had said. Annalise stood frozen, her face flushed with humiliation. The audience she had carefully gathered now turned entirely against her, but Lavinia barely noticed any of it. She was looking at Benedict, at the man who had walked past every expectation, every assumption, every easy choice, to choose her. The man who had just declared, in front of an entire kingdom's worth of nobility, that he loved her not as a formality, not as part of an arrangement, but simply because it was true. I love you too, she said quietly, quiet enough that it was meant only for him. Though, in the silence of the ballroom, those nearby heard it as well, and the murmur of approval grew warmer still. Benedict smiled the kind of smile that, months ago, Lavinia had never seen him wear, and now saw often. Then, he said softly, I believe that settles everything. He raised her hand gently and pressed a soft kiss to it, a simple gesture, but one that, in the formal language of royal courts, carried unmistakable meaning. The ballroom, almost as one, broke into applause. Annalise, with nowhere left to stand and nothing left to say, quietly excused herself from the gathering, slipping away into the crowd, her earlier confidence completely gone, while the rest of the room continued to celebrate around the Luna who, by every measure that actually mattered, had finally been seen. 1 year later, the gardens of Blackwood Palace were in full bloom. Lavinia walked slowly along the familiar path, her hand resting comfortably in Benedict's, the late afternoon sun warm against her skin. The kingdom, in the months since the royal pack gathering, had continued to change slowly, steadily. In the quiet way real change tends to happen. Border disputes that had simmered for years had been resolved. Smaller territories, once overlooked, now had genuine representation in decisions that affected them. The palace itself felt different, too warmer, somehow, despite being made of the same cold stone it had always been. "Do you remember?" Benedict said, as they walked. "The first time we stood in this garden together?" Lavinia smiled. "You mean the time you were hiding behind a hedge, listening to me talk to a tree?" Benedict laughed, a real, warm laugh, one of many that had become common over the past year. "I prefer to think of it as an unconventional first meeting. I prefer. You were spying on me. I was gathering important information. You were spying." Benedict pulled her gently closer, pressing a soft kiss to her temple. "Either way," he said quietly, "that night changed everything. For both of us." Lavinia leaned into him, looking out over the gardens, the same gardens where, a year ago, she had quietly told an old oak tree that she didn't believe anyone would ever truly see her. She had been wrong. "It did," she agreed softly. "Though, I think," she paused, considering, "I think it didn't just change things. I think it gave both of us something we didn't know we were missing." "And what's that?" Lavinia looked up at him, her smile warm and certain. "Someone to share it with," she said simply. "All of it. The good days, the difficult ones, everything in between." Benedict pulled her close, resting his forehead gently against hers. "Then, I suppose," he murmured, "I should be grateful I decided to hide behind that hedge." Lavinia laughed softly, the sound carrying through the quiet garden, the same garden where, a year ago, an alpha king had arrived disguised as a servant, and overheard something that changed everything. And as the sun began to set over Blackwood Palace, casting the gardens in warm golden light, Lavinia Blackwood, once the overlooked daughter of a struggling pack, now the beloved Luna of an entire kingdom, walked hand in hand with the man who had chosen her, not for her beauty, not for her usefulness, but simply for who she truly was, exactly as she deserved.